We've got a democratic socialism video to react to, Carlos. I guess we did it earlier. We reacted to it before, but I mean, we got like 7 minutes and 30 seconds in. So they sent it to us again, and said to check it out from that point. If you're down,
Yeah.
let's do it.
Is that where I'm going to end up?
Stories like these pushed the country to a breaking point. Public outrage poured into the streets. We are Occupy movements across the country demonized capitalism, blaming it for the country's widespread economic inequality.
Uh-oh. Did you see what that guy's sign said? Not good. Oh,
Occupy movements across the country demonized capitalism.
Is that Haas?
Oh, little pot sock. We got a pot sock in the house, mate.
It's a mecha tanky. Occupy is canceled.
Blaming it for the country's widespread economic inequality. Burdened by student debt and a tough job market, for many millennials, it seemed the free market wasn't working. Many wanted radical reform, but it wasn't until Bernie Sanders ran for president that they found a bigger name for their cause. America's socialist movement was reborn. Sanders had effectively tapped into a fresh crop.
This is random, but have you ever seen that Sacha Baron Cohen bit where he's interviewing Bernie? He's like, we need to take the 99% and put it inside of the 1%. Bernie's like, I don't think you're understanding.
Bernie's one of the few politicians who didn't fall for Cohen's shit. All the other ones just completely fall for it. It's hilarious. But I was just talking about this with Dust, who I know is not a big fan of Bernie, right? But for people in our generation, Bernie was the only thing close to socialism that we had to grab onto, right? He played such an important mediational steps, and his flaws, the lack of a consistent anti-imperialist outlook, the bending to the Democrats in every which way possible, his flaws helped the people he brought in realize that he's not going to do it. There's something beyond Bernie needs to be done. And for me, Bernie was the Trojan horse towards Marxism-Leninism, right? But that I don't know if that's generationally specific, because the generation before us had Occupy Wall Street, and maybe what Bernie does to the socialist ideas that they had already constructed is dilute it, right? But I know that for my generation, at least, Bernie was something that came out of nowhere. There was no such socialism floating around, and it was extremely helpful in the development of a lot of people our age.
Yeah, I think that's something we've talked about on the channel a lot, probably a lot because you and I both worked on the campaign. But yeah, I remember there was a tweet that got like 5,000 likes or so that said the Bernie campaign telling everybody that Cuba isn't socialist, and socialism is democratic socialism, basically, or equating socialism with social democracy was a bad thing, the campaign in general. And I do see that argument. Like you said, it did, in various ways water down socialism and anti-imperialism. And Bernie should have just stood by his guns and, stood by Cuba and Venezuela, because they're going to smear you for it anyways. And just point out where, just point to the rural healthcare programs that those countries have enacted versus the U.S., where 100 rural hospitals have shut down, in the past decade because it's not profitable. Whereas Cuba and Venezuela are achieving universal healthcare, which with much less resources. But anyways, I do think the campaign, like you said, though, was the Trojan horse for a lot of people in moving further left, which, a lot of that has been DSA, or a lot of former Bernie people are I'm a Marxist, but they're really just rad libs. So there's that too. So it goes both ways. But yeah, I think overall it was a positive thing, because for me, I thought socialism was, the word itself was evil. I remember someone told me they supported Bernie in high school, and I was like, he's a socialist. And then I looked into it and I'm like, well, this makes sense. And like you said, that was sort of the Trojan horse.
I remember the first time we had a Bernie meeting in our campus and you came. And we were joking about Stalin. you were so uncomfortable. But I think, when people go into that, I think most of them sooner or later, hopefully sooner, will come to realize the flaws, right?
Right.
Um, just like capital is its own grave diggers, the left wing sort of alternatives that capital creates in order to deviate people from Marxism, Leninism, and from the communist struggle, they are their own grave diggers as well, because people lay so much hope in this, and we know they're going to disappoint. We know they were going to disappoint, right? But we have to be there because the masses are there. We have to be there and point that shit out. That's what Lenin tells us to do, right? Don't ignore the unions just because they're led by right opportunists and labor aristocrats. Go into those unions because the workers are there, and call out their flaws. The people that are running it, call out their flaws. And that's how you're going to get the masses.
Exactly. And it's so, like, from within the campaign, it was so easy to do that. Like, you have all these people who know about Bernie's policies, and then you sit down to watch the CNN and MSNBC debates, and they're like, talking, why do you support Medicare for all, Bernie, when it's going to make everybody have to pay way more for healthcare and socialized medicine in Venezuela, blah, blah, blah. And people are like, this shit is rigged, or when they watch the DNC shenanigans, and, like you said, it makes people realize that those electoral efforts are mostly futile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Of socialists, even though his platform wasn't offering anything particularly different to what he had already been talking about for decades.
In our society, theoretically a democratic society, you have a handful of people who control our economy. You have maybe 2% of the population that owns 1/3 of the entire wealth of America, 80% of the stocks, 90% of the bonds. And these people have incredible power.
Nearly 40 years later, Sanders' vision of a socialist America has finally gone mainstream. Bhaskar Sumkara was one of the early adopters. When he launched the magazine Jacobin in 2010, it was, in theory, a pretty bad idea. Not only was print dying, Bhaskar's niche quarterly was going to target America's socialists before the country had actually started talking or caring about socialism again. But the 21-year-old college student followed his gut, and the gamble paid off. Jacobin struck a nerve, and its circulation took off.
Socialism in the U.S. has been a marginal.
Is it not Jacobin?
Jacobin. What?
Is that how you say it in French?
I mean, it's such a well-made documentary. They could have found it. How it's Jacobin.
Yeah, bro. Everyone calls it Jacobin, right? And we took a class called DMOC where you basically reenact the French Revolution in college, and you got to be part of the Jacobin Party. It's like a historical term.
Mine, the one that I did ended up being we did the one with India, so I don't think.
Oh yeah, did you? Well, we did that and France. We did India and France. Oh well, we don't need to relive our undergrad.
Those are for many decades, so I think we're kind of inventing things from scratch now.
A 2018 Gallup poll showed the Democrats have a way more positive image of socialism than they do of capitalism.
If you look at Fortune 500 CEOs, these people have tremendous say over your lives, over what you consume, over how you work, over the future of our country. And they're subject to no democratic mandate. They're accountable to no one but their shareholders.
And there's one group working to change that on the ground. The Democratic Socialists of America bills itself as the largest socialist organization in the country.
So I just want to go back to the fact that socialism is more popular than capitalism among Democrats. I was just watching Kyle Kulinski the other day, and he was talking about MSNBC and CNN. And they are still saying, Biden's approval ratings or his polling is down because he's too far left. And it's like, what? The whole Democratic Party considers themselves socialist. And this dude's not following through on any of his left-wing progressive campaign promises. And people, the masses who are struggling in this country, who for some reason still associate with the Democratic Party because they think it's better.
But they've been
doing anything for him. That's why his polling's low.
They've been doing that from the start, even at a time when Bernie was running, the core policies, Medicare for all, free college, cancel student debt, All of those policies, their approval ratings amongst Democrats were in the 80%, and amongst Republicans in the high 50s, 60%. That quite literally means that the vast majority of the American people favored the policies of Bernie. But it's so strange. It's so strange how um, they're able to just contradict the facts in your face, and yet some people still swallow it.
Yeah. And when it comes to a policy like Medicare for all, the polling now shows it has like 60% support among Republicans. And like, that's something I have anecdotal evidence of, including when I talked to my buddy's family from Louisiana. They're like, we can afford that if we can afford to send, all these weapons to Ukraine. Why can't we afford
Mhm.
healthcare? It's like people aren't stupid. But they're gaslit by these corporate outlets like MSNBC, CNN, whatever else, even Fox and Fox too. Yeah, into thinking these policies are socialism or they're gonna hurt the workers. Oops.
It has its own firebrand version of socialism, with some members who want to abolish the Senate and get rid of capitalism. It's been around since 1982, but it went from the fringe to the mainstream in 2015. DSA membership is up nearly tenfold since Bernie Sanders came onto the scene, and its politicians are winning races across the country at every level of government.
I don't know what this history of democratic socialism is. She said it became a thing in like the 70s, and now it's big.
Yeah, it's like the Michael Harrington um, era. Some of the founders, I didn't think they were that big. They come from SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, which was fairly big in the late '60s. Reagan's was a part of it. It's one of those orgs that was a pretty broad tent. You can find anything from trots to Marxist Leninists to anarchists to sock Dems and just rad libs. Um, I I think that's what she's referring to.
Hmm, that's interesting.
The DSA has a huge presence in New York. Every borough has its own branch, and Brooklyn has 3. We headed to one of their local meetups in Queens to see what they're really like when they meet behind closed doors, and to get a feel for what socialist policy actually looks like at the grassroots level. Jackson Heights is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in America. It's also part of New York's 14th congressional district, which is currently represented by AOC. AOC is a card-holding member, as is the politician you see here, New York State Senator Julia Salazar. The two women have a few big things in common. Salazar is 28.
That's so crazy that AOC is a card-holding member of a socialist party in this country. Someone asked earlier, what are thoughts on AOC? A Democrat, just like all the other Democrats, except probably worse because she calls herself a socialist while doing Democrat stuff.
Yeah, it's traditional right opportunism, right? Except that whereas the Second International, the right opportunism was grounded on giving at least a little bit to the working classes of their own nation so that you can continue voting for war credits. We don't get shit. We ain't getting shit from them, but yet they continue to vote for war credits, for money to Ukraine, for funding for the Iron Dome in Israel. So it's difficult, but I think, like Bernie, she probably created a movement in New York of people who got interested in socialism, and that's a big step. Going from realizing that the the stuff that you feel is messed up in your everyday life is not a result of policies of what party is in control of the politicians. Going from that to realizing that it's a systemic issue, right? That it's the whole way we organize society is a big step. And when these people call themselves socialists, even though theirs is not really socialism, they help people understand that the issues are systemic. And by their own failures, they help them understand that the people who brought them to this socialism aren't the solution. And just like Bernie, I think AOC plays a similar function.
Definitely. And I guess, but what's serving as a bulwark sometimes from those politicians serving that function is like these propaganda outlets, even on YouTube, like the Majority Report and the Young Turks. that if you follow them and all, I don't know if people do, but they just, do propaganda around the clock. AOC and Bernie can do no wrong. And that, stops people from seeing that, no, AOC hasn't fought for Medicare for all. She hasn't fought for anything. And then, when she like voted for the Iron Dome funding in Israel and then turned it into like a performative thing where she was crying and, acting about, this is so hard for me. It's like, you just voted to kill a bunch of Palestinian children. Like, nobody cares how hard this is for you. So the individualism is frustrating, but I mean, that's the political theater. And that's the sort of purpose that the system serves. But yeah, it's frustrating when some of those new media outlets that pretend to be progressive are just doing apologetics for the Democratic Party. But, that's to be expected. You're always going to have that.
Years old, a graduate of a top university, and a fresh face in American politics.
As democratic socialists, we are acutely aware of the racial bias that is endemic in our criminal legal system. We're acutely aware of how that racial bias intersects with the criminalization of poverty.
During our visit, Salazar was talking about criminal justice reform to help drum up support for fellow DSA member Tiffany Caban, a public defender running for Queens District Attorney.
Let's go knock some doors and make some change happen.
Okay, but what? They never say what they're going to do about it. It's like we as Democrats are acutely aware of how racial bias and poverty lead to disproportionate incarceration and how that's, used to make money. Okay, so what are you going to do? What are you going to do to get, are you going to nationalize the companies who are part of the prison industrial complex and make, the small amount of prisons that are private, make them public or stop any profiteering off the prison system? Are you radically going to reform the justice system, decriminalize drugs, and move to, setting up rehabilitation centers instead of mass incarcerating drug addicts? Or are we just going to be acutely aware of the intersection between poverty and racism, that our militarized police force, enforces on the masses? Like, being acutely aware of it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, you saying what are you gonna do reminds me of an old Twisted Sister. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're an old rock band.
Oh yeah,
but they have a video that's
E. Snyder.
They have the dad is like the controlling strict dad, and
we're not gonna take it. Yeah.
What are you gonna do with your life? And he's like, I want to rock.
Oh no, I want to rock.
Yeah. What are you gonna do with your power? I complain that I can't do anything with it and not push for Medicare for all or for anything really.
All right, fall in line with Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
AOC does not want to rock.
No.
We had the chance to canvass with some of Caban's supporters, like Ryan Breckenthal, a New York teacher and veteran activist.
Our ideal version of America is one where every human being is given the things that they need to survive and thrive. A place where people don't have to go bankrupt from having hospital bills, making sure that good paying union jobs are provided for those who are looking for them, making sure that we have a new economy that is sustainable and can continue life on Earth as we know it.
The DA race is...
I like how that guy pitched the socialist message. I like the working class guy. More of him, less of the politicians, huh? That guy hit on like 3 issues. He had solutions. They were all relatable, stuff that affects everyone.
Well, usually when it comes to national politics, I mean, Bernie's usually on the money. And the way that he says things, he says it in a very relatable way, right? But there really isn't much like practical substance behind it, though. There is some, but not enough. And by not being able to tie it to like the imperialist foreign policy and stuff, you really diminish some of the things he says. But I mean, the contradictions of capital are apparent. Like, people see the inequality. People see 60,000 people dying because they lack medical insurance. They see the absurdity of the prices of insurance. They see the contradictions in their everyday life. So that's stuff that these SOCDEMs build on, and some of them have very nice speech patterns. They've talked about it over and over and over again, so it comes out very smoothly. But we have to realize after 5, 6, 7 years that this Bernie Sanders SOCDEM movement has been really since it took off, right? It hasn't brought anything of substance to any community. So it's not the option. We have to do something else. We have to bank on their failures and continue to hammer out the message. What they diagnose the problem sometimes quite well, and we have something to learn about how they do it. They've been able to bring millions and millions of Americans to it. So there's something to learn about how they talk, what they focus on that we can use. But when we use it, it should be actually for a revolutionary project.
Yeah, they miss the root of the issue. And like a perfect concrete example is imperialism being the primary contradiction, in the stage of global capitalism that we're in. And generally, when the primary imperialist conflict is going on, and when the propaganda is at its highest level, the SOCDEMs tend to take the wrong side. So like Bernie siding with the carpet bombing of Yugoslavia, which allowed for the extension of NATO towards Russia's borders. Bernie, taking the imperialist line on Ukraine. And it's like, it goes back to what I say, like everyone's an imperial or an anti-imperialist in hindsight, right? Everyone is an anti-imperialist in 2020. And Bernie gets a lot of credit for being against the Iraq war, and that was good. But the only reason we see that as good is because, the rest of our politicians are so terrible and they voted for a murderous war like Iraq, and it's like, if you're going to be anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, when these things like SOS Cuba are going on, or when these things like, the conflict in Ukraine are going on, you can't just be, repeating the imperialist narrative and taking the imperialist side. Otherwise, you're just making yourself a tool of them at these vital times of political crisis, which is what social democrats have always done. I mean, look, maybe the best example is Germany. When Germany could have split, they could have gone and become a socialist republic, or they could have become the fascist Nazi Germany that they did become. And the social democrats sided with the fascists and killed Rosa Luxemburg and the communist leaders. So at these times of political crisis, the social democrats tend to go the wrong way. And it's because they're missing the root of the issue.
Right. And it's also a very specific geopolitically placed kind of social democrats, right? Because, some of the socialist projects in the South are closer to social democracy than to like Marxism, Leninism. But because of the position that they hold with respects to imperialism, they don't fall into the right opportunism of the social democrats in the North, because there just isn't a condition to fall into right opportunism, right? So that's always like a social democrat in Latin America is usually with respects to foreign policy in the right place.
Right.
And it's social democratic and in the sense of more national politics, strategies of how to get the power, how to use the state, right? But when it comes to opposing imperialism, they're usually a little better than the ones in the North whose social democracy is all based on ciphering people away from connecting the working class struggle at home with the anti-imperialist struggle, and literally just folding in the face of imperialism and functioning as right opportunists.
Absolutely.
Is one of many political battles being waged by democratic socialists intent on carving out a place for the DSA in mainstream American politics.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the Lower Manhattan branch of the DSA.
At another meetup of the DSA, this time across town in Manhattan's East Village, another chapter was planning its own offensive. This one centered on ensuring housing is a basic human right through an ambitious universal rent control campaign.
So the Universal Rent Control platform is a series of 9 bills. And although they are not sort of like utopian socialism, they are by far the strongest offensive use of the law to protect renters that we have virtually ever.
Some in the room feared media exposure of their meeting could hurt the movement. One person raised a motion at the start of the meeting requesting that we leave. And we were ultimately asked to turn the cameras off for their strategy session, which goes to show just how sensitive this issue still is politically. But as the democratic socialist movement gains momentum and even real positions of power in the United States, some worry socialism in any form is a slippery slope.
Let's by all means have an argument about whether the United States should have
the Hoover Institution. I don't know. I think fighting for rent control is a good idea for any party. Anytime you can get material benefits for the people in your community, that's a good thing. I know that was one thing that CPUSA was working on in our community, was trying to get utility prices lowered, or get an extension on the utility freeze, which would prevent landlords from turning people's utilities off if they weren't able to pay. So anytime like you can use the law or use any methods really to get gains for the working class like that as a party, it's good to go ahead and do it.
We are against reformism, not reforms.
Exactly. Yes.
Have a more progressive tax policy. Let's by all means have an argument about whether the really broken system of healthcare in the United States, which is both the most expensive and the least efficient in the world, could be reformed. But let's not dignify socialism, because before you know it, you'll be letting real socialism in by the back door. And that's
yeah,
the way to happen.
Exactly. Once people fix our healthcare system and they realize the problem is capitalism, and the more we go towards socialized medicine, the better the healthcare system gets, then they'll let communism right in the back door, right through the poop chute.
That's the real Trojan horse.
Yep. I can't stand the healthcare thing, man, because people use socialized medicine like it's evil, and I'm like, I'm doing a grad program in healthcare administration right now, and one of the main things I've realized is the health insurance companies are the worst. They are the worst part of the American healthcare system. They are just a mafia that stands in between you and your healthcare. They have nothing to do with providing healthcare. But they're not even the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the profit motive in general. The fact that you're able to make profit off healthcare in general, because the whole thing's commodified now. So like, there's companies making money off the ambulances, making money off the IV bags, making money off all the technology and equipment. The hospitals are private. The doctors' offices are private. And they're all connected to these giant healthcare conglomerates like United Health Group, which are made up of shareholders in insurance, in pharmaceuticals, and everything related to healthcare. It's like, this is just a cluster. And the reason it can't be fixed is because these companies spend billions of dollars lobbying the government in their own interests every year. It's like, first the government needs to be seized by the working class, and then the government needs to be used to nationalize these companies and make the healthcare system completely public. So I don't know. I guess I don't agree that we need to have communism let in the back door. We need to have workers take power so that they can let public rational healthcare in the back door.
Yeah, and it's they shoot themselves in the foot, because if the capitalist class was smart, they'd create the sort of condition where, like in Europe, some of the basic necessities are met, but you continue your exploitation of people and you continue reaping great profits. Of course, we know that those conditions are in Europe because of the struggle of communists and of labor unions, right? The capitalists there weren't any smarter than the ones here. They just had less resources to fight against this. But if they were really smart, they'd realize, as we've said a million times, that the best answer for American capitalism was Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm. Be the savior of American capitalism.
Yeah, like FDR. That's what FDR did.
Yep. That was the compromise. Social democracy was the compromise with the communists.
Mm-hmm.
Some point to authoritarian leaders who promised the virtues of socialism, but led their people down a path of economic despair and limited
3 in a row, baby.
Critics of
Stalin, Mao,
socialism
and
would point to
Fidel.
examples like Venezuela and the USSR, where it hasn't played out well. What
Lenin
do you say
and
to
Maduro,
those
gang,
critics?
gang.
This speaks partly to the distinction between democratic socialism
DPRK.
and socialism more broadly, that under democratic socialism, it's led by the people. There's accountability at every level. Socialist governments throughout history, some of their problems have really been due to a lack of democracy and a socialist.
I like how she says, these socialist governments are led by the people, as they're holding up pictures of Kim Il-sung and Mao and Stalin.
There's millions of people.
Damn right.
Yeah.
The People's Republic.
Sorry, that socialism's not led by the people, as there's a literal fucking video of millions of people with the heads of states.
Right. They were forced to do that at gunpoint.
Yeah.
That really is driven by the grassroots and by the people.
The socialism being promulgated by the DSA has somewhat lost the stigma, partly because it's dropped its Soviet context. It's also less controversial since modern-day America is already deeply rooted in policies once deemed socialist, from 5-day work weeks to universal public education, Medicare, Social Security, and public welfare programs. But perhaps most importantly, some say socialism isn't as taboo as it used to be because people don't really care what you call it so long as it results in a more equitable society. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz says the policies tend to speak for themselves.
When AOC or Bernie Sanders lists the things that they're concerned about, everybody having health insurance, an education to live up to their opportunity, a decent retirement, access to a good mortgage, a decent housing, access to a decent job. You ask people, do they want that? The answer is yes. The response of many other people, if you call that socialist, we're socialists. If you call that progressive capitalist, we're progressive capitalists. Whatever you name it, that's what we want. And so I think we shouldn't get hung up over these particular words.
In practical terms, politicians like Bernie Sanders and AOC have a pretty ambitious wish list. Universal health care in the form of Medicare for all, the federal jobs guarantee, and a higher minimum wage.
One thing that Stalin does a good job of laying out in Foundations of Leninism is he explains that Marxism, Leninism, or just Leninism more generally, is it attacks capitalism at its foundations. So it attacks capitalism at its root, and it always shows people how, the crimes of imperialism and the negative things that result from imperialism, or the negative things that result from capitalism and exploitation, how they're tied to capitalism and tied to class society itself, how they're tied to the wage labor relation that exists under capitalism, versus DSA, as that guy's saying, it's a lot of, we'll give you a good job, a lot of flowery sounding rhetoric without attacking the system at its foundations. And then, as we've said, it's resulted in very few gains. So I think that's, like, if you're going to have a lasting movement, if you're going to have a movement that's going to grow over time, not just be spontaneous and flutter out and, flutter up again every 4 years when there's an election, you need to have a theoretical understanding of the system of capitalism, and you need to be attacking it at its foundations. And you can talk about these, good paying job, other good things benefits that'll come about from socialism, but you can't say, this is the same as progressive capitalism, because it's not.
I had to hold in the laugh because for a second I thought, someone coming in to the stream, they're watching the DemSoc video, out of nowhere you pause it and you're like, one thing Stalin does really well. I just put myself in the place of someone, just a healthy, innocent DemSoc video, and then we start talking about Stalin.
Look at these two Bernie staffers watching a CNBC video. Like, the best thing about Stalin was he wasn't afraid to purge his friends.
But I'd like to say that Joseph Stiglitz is right. So I might be in tension with you there. I want to say that he's right. You can call these policies progressive capitalist or socialist, whatever you want, because the distinction of what is capitalism, what is not based on policy. It's based on who is in control of the means of production, who's in control of state power. And that's why people confuse. We had a couple of weeks ago, a stream, someone asked us about the Nordic countries, right? The Scandinavian countries. And someone asked a question about what's the difference between them and China, if some of the policies, the social welfare policies, seem similar. Well, who's in power in China? Who's in power in the Scandinavian countries? That's the difference, right? The reforms that the people have gotten in China, it's because at the head of China is a communist party with more than 100 million members that's connected to the mass and that's fighting for socialism. At the head of the Scandinavian countries is not a communist party, it's not a workers' party. They're these social democratic parties that are still capitalist parties, right? And who give out, bits here and there to the masses. But that's the big difference, right? We can have these measures that seem like what the stuff that the socialists do, but the socialists do it because they're in power. We're not.
Absolutely. And State and Revolution is a great book for learning about that, and who's in charge of the state, what that means, dictatorship of the proletariat versus dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Shout out to Lenin. He's a pretty good author. I'm a fan.
Mass unionization of the workforce, plus stronger protection for those unions, tuition for university, some form of a universal basic income, the dissolution of ICE, just to name a few. Other more controversial and contested measures like abolishing the prison system have also made it onto the legislative agendas of some Democratic socialists. Freshman Congresswoman AOC has already begun to aggressively push her socialist agenda on Capitol Hill. Just take the Green New Deal, designed to put a stop to the country's dependence on carbon-based energy.
We are facing a national crisis. And if we do not ascend to that crisis, if we tell the American public that we are more willing to invest and bail out big banks than we are willing to invest in our farmers and our urban families, then I don't know what we're here doing.
While details for the so-called Green New Deal are sparse, several of the 2020 presidential hopefuls are throwing their weight behind the plan. Then there's Sanders' Medicare for All bill that he formally introduced in 2017 after stumping for it in the 2016 election.
I am just very excited about the kind of support our Medicare for All legislation is receiving all across this country and right here in the United States Senate.
Bernie's single-payer national health insurance plan has garnered support from many Democrats vying for the party's bid in 2020. AOC and Sanders also back housing as a fundamental right, which is still a pretty radical concept in the U.S.
One good thing about the Bernie campaign, and I'll say this because we worked for him and took it pretty seriously and tried to study the policies and study the literature that the campaign gave us, but they had a very concrete policy plan and proposal laid out, things they wanted to do immediately upon taking office or start fighting for. And I think a communist or socialist party should have the same thing, right? Because we know we have to transition to socialism out of our current system, out of capitalism. So I think it would make sense to have a concrete policy base, as in this is what we're fighting for, this is what we want to enact. Like socialists or communists in the past running for president for CPUSA or whatever, would say like desegregation or an end to Jim Crow laws, free housing, nationalize certain companies, unionize or universal unions, universal healthcare, stuff like that. But then, Bernie also had the details laid out, so you could go to his website and see, how much everything would cost and have it laid out like that. Which I think is a good thing for scientific socialist parties to do as well.
And he would do it everywhere he went. Like I saw him in Wisconsin and in a few cities in Iowa and in Illinois. And in each place, the speech, although the core of it was the same, it would be adjusted to the particular issues of the area. And that sort of level of concreteness. That's something that we should definitely have. I was noticing AOC talking. You can tell she's Hispanic because of the hand movements. When I go back and look at the videos we make, I notice that I do it too. And it's like, well, that's our thing, I guess.
You're expressive.
Yes.
Policy ideas like these may be popular, but there's always that one big question. How do you pay for it? 10-year estimates from nonpartisan and left-leaning groups show that these proposals could add up to a price tag of more than $42 trillion. And this number does not factor in the expected $11.4 trillion deficit over the next 10 years.
I wonder, what if you just totaled up the corporate profit of even just health insurance companies? It might be over $11.4 trillion. Just get rid of them. Just get rid of the shareholders who are making money off healthcare, and you can already afford all these socialist policies. But they're always like, how do we afford socialism? No, how do we afford the parasitic class who owns more wealth than the bottom 99% of society combined or whatever? This tiny percent of bankers and financiers at the top of society making bajillions through exploiting the rest of us. How are we going to afford to continue to pay them that much wealth while the rest of us starve? That's what we really need to ask ourselves. Not how can we afford healthcare? We know we can afford healthcare. We have the most advanced or technologically advanced healthcare system in the world. We just, not everybody can afford it because so much wealth is being hoarded by the capitalist class.
And half of the taxes we pay go to fund the empire's military apparatus, so they can have 900 fucking bases all over the world. There's more than enough money there to pay for the things that Bernie and these quote unquote progressive Democrats were proposing. That's such a dumb question. They've been doing it to China. So the percentage of people dying from COVID in China is extremely low just because of the measures that they've taken. Because when you have a people-centered economy and a people-centered state, you approach a pandemic differently than when you have a profit-centered economy and the state functions to facilitate, the accumulation of profit. And the articles that you see, it's, China death rates low, but at what cost? What? And it makes even less sense when you realize that while most economies like GDP has gone down, their GDP growth has gone down, China's been the only one that's been somewhat stable or growing. So not only have they prevented, countless death, but they've maintained their economic growth.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You get sort of like the dialectical inversion where people are placing commodities or just money, the money commodity, above human lives, where they're like, China has saved all these lives, but at what financial cost? And it's like, what do you mean? Like, how can you think that a dollar bill is more important than all these human lives? Even though China has kept their economy going, kept their GDP going, and it hasn't been that much of a financial cost. Obviously, keeping the economy going matters, but it's interesting how I think that falls under like commodity fetishism, where people are so blinded by the capitalist economy and the money commodity, the universal equivalent, that they're willing to say something ridiculous like China's saving all these lives, but at what cost? What financial cost?
Oh, and at the beginning, I remember the people Fox News would bring on, they'd be like, "Look, we gotta sacrifice old people."
Yeah, straight up, there were people in the capitalist media saying like, I don't care, like my grandma's got to go back to work, or like we need to sacrifice people for the economy. Like, this is bizarre to watch.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Already anticipated under current law. It also doesn't include the Green New Deal, which Republican critics say could cost tens of trillions of dollars.
The plans proposed by Senator Sanders and AOC are not remotely affordable in the United States. Any one of them might look affordable in the abstract, but when you put them together,
these guys all look the same.
I've been working for the Hoover Institute and the Manhattan Institute. I
These
have
are
worked
some
with
support.
Rand Paul and the Koch brothers. I'm highly prestiged in my field. These policies are too expensive.
Just change the color of their hair. Sometimes they throw a guy with blonde hair. Sometimes they change it up, but they're all the fucking same, man. They all got the same haircut, except for that one guy from Prager with the Justin Bieber haircut.
Yeah.
But it's usually the same haircut. You put a nice suit. You have the sort of way that they talk. You make it somewhat clean, and that's it.
Puffy face. For those of you who follow us on TikTok, this is Benjamin Politics. I've accused him of just repeating like what right-wing think tanks say on their websites, and he says, good, like I would love to work for the Hoover Institute one day. And yeah, this guy probably dreamed of working at the Hoover Institute his whole life. Probably used to make TikToks defending billionaires, and now here he is. He made it.
add up. You're well over $42 trillion over 10 years. That would basically double the size of the federal government. If you're going to get socialism in America, you need substantially higher taxes, and not just on the rich, but on everybody else. If you go to Sweden or Norway or Finland, you'll realize that it's not just the rich paying 50-60% taxes, it's the middle class.
AOC has put forward one plan to cover part of that $42 trillion bill.
That's
She wants to raise the federal tax rate on incomes over $10 million to
Scandinavia.
70%. To put that into perspective, Sanders' 2016 presidential platform capped the top tax rate at 54.2%. Assuming no tax planning, AOC's proposal would bring in $700 billion over 10 years. Medicare for All is estimated to be the single biggest expense on the agenda, but it's also one of the policies that Democratic Socialists say will actually make money in the end.
Well, some of the measures, let's say for health insurance, in fact, I believe
At least they
a net
mentioned
savings
that.
if you cut out some of the private insurance bureaucracies and some of the waste of mismanagement in our current system. So I think Medicare for All, for example, would pay for itself and then some.
But critics argue the math doesn't work out for a couple different reasons.
That's not true at all. First, what Senator Sanders is proposing is
even the oh my, I paused it right on a good spot. This is what these people are. His soul is coming out of his face right there. Even the George Mason Koch brothers funded study, the same right-wing think tanks who fund guys like this, even their study said that Medicare for All would save $3 million, which is part of the Hill collected 21 studies that confirm that Medicare for All would save money. But there's even more than that, dude. There's like hundreds. I'm telling you, this is, I don't want to appeal to authority all the time, but this is what my field of study is right now, is the healthcare system, healthcare administration, like, I promise you it would save money. The health insurance companies are robbing you. They're robbing you. They're making billions of dollars, and they're paying guys like this to lie to you about it.
Extraordinarily larger than anything the private sector does, and it's actually more generous than what other countries do. You could basically get any medical procedure you want, anytime, with no deductibles, no copays, full long-term care for seniors. Nobody does that. Because nobody figured out how to really create a tax that converts every dollar of private healthcare spending that doesn't bankrupt families and small businesses.
We don't need a tax, so we're going to nationalize all your
totally
companies.
erasing student debt. The College for All Act from Bernie Sanders would erase the student debt of 45 million Americans. He'd pay for that $1.6 trillion expense with a new tax on Wall Street transactions. But democratic socialism isn't just about advocating for these kinds of expansions of the social safety net. The movement is also pushing to give workers more power over corporations. Sanders wants to create more public ownership over corporate boards. Under the plan, corporations would have to do two big things. One, give workers a certain number.
On this plan, members of the Central Party would be on the board of all the most powerful companies in America, and they would direct these companies to work in the interests of the masses and Chairman Sanders. And there would be party cadres in each area who would report to Chairman Sanders, and then we would make central plans that would allow for great economic construction that would unleash the forces of production and create a great socialist, a great and strong socialist society in this country.
Right on. Yeah, the platform for the working class that Bernie had with the attempts to raise unionization levels, to have a federal jobs program, those are pretty darn solid, right? Especially for the conditions we're in. Those were pretty good. Those were, I remember when we would go to working class communities to knock doors, that was usually one of the openers that I used just because it made so much sense.
Right. People identify, like when you argued from a place of ownership, we noticed this during the Bernie campaign. Like when we argued these social democratic positions, they were less effective with working class people than arguing like, Bernie wants to give you a share of the company, or Bernie, wants to put working class people on the board of your company. People are like, oh, like, that makes sense. My board at my company doesn't know shit, or my boss doesn't know anything about the workplace. We need people in the workplace on the board. And that's, arguing from a more traditional class struggle position or proletarian position, or arguing for, ownership of or control over the means of production as a way to improve people's lives and give them more control. And yeah, I think we found that was successful, that was popular with people.
Number of seats on its board of directors, and two, contribute stock to an employee-led fund that would pay out regular dividends to the company's workers. Democratic Socialists also want to take on banks. In May 2019, Sanders and AOC called banks modern-day loan sharks and proposed a dramatic cut to credit card interest rates.
No bank in this country should have credit card interest rates of over 15%.
We talk about payday lending, and in New York, we work very hard to outlaw payday lending. But what happens when everyday banks start to charge higher and higher interest rates? Essentially, your credit card becomes a payday loan.
They're also pitching legislation to cap rates on consumer loans. The American Bankers Association argues this plan would ultimately hurt the consumer by restricting their access to credit. But on the whole, policy ideas like these are receiving a lot of positive feedback. Amazon HQ2, on the other hand, wasn't as clear.
By the way, it says in the Bible, in the Quran, and I'm pretty sure in the Torah, I don't know if it's in the Torah, but in the Bible and the Quran for sure, that, lending and with interest is illegal. If you're looking for a way to sell socialism and pitch socialism to your religious relatives or whatever. Yeah.
Cut a case.
Breaking news, Amazon canceling its controversial plans.
Now it will not build a headquarters in New York.
The world's biggest company just got sent packing thanks to an unfriendly welcome by New Yorkers.
In February 2019, the company ditched its plan to build one of its two new headquarters in Queens. The governor and mayor had both backed the deal, as had a majority of New York City registered voters, according to a Quinnipiac University poll. But there was one very notable...
Okay, so we should talk about this, Carlos. What do you think about this? Because in a way, she stopped fixed capital and productive capital from coming to New York. And the voters apparently had democratically agreed to subsidize this Amazon facility. So it would have created jobs and it would have brought productive capacity to New York, but, it would have allowed for the extension of Jeff Bezos's Amazon empire, and, the jobs would have been extremely exploitative that it brought. So did AOC do the right thing there in blocking that, or should she, would the better socialist position been to have, said, okay, because people voted for this, we'll subsidize this, and and have Amazon build this facility here, but we're going to try and put these stipulations on it. You know, maybe say you got to put these stipulate, or maybe that's what AOC tried to do, and then Amazon just said we're not going to build there. I don't know, but what do you think?
Yeah, right. Since the question is about subsidizing, and not about, you know, how we feel about Amazon opening a new facility there. That changes the dynamic of the answer, because if that's literally the state subsidizing so that a massive corporation can continue to get bigger, but it would have promoted jobs. The thing is that the jobs that Amazon brings are low-paying jobs that most people who have those jobs usually have to go on government aid in order to eat, in order to pay rent, to do the basic things that they have to do. So I don't know. I wasn't at that time aware that there were like statistical information coming out about what like unions and organized labor was saying about this potential move. So I don't know. I think that whatever organized labor felt was right at that moment was probably something that should have been listened to quite closely.
I think that's a good position to take generally.
Figure who was against the plan.
Organizers and residents of my community were busting down our doors saying, you need to say something about this.
AOC State Senator Julia Salazar and the DSA, along with a coalition of unions and local left-leaning groups, opposed the $3 billion in state and city tax breaks that Amazon would have received. As AOC celebrated Amazon's decision to pull out of New York.
I mean, it shows that everyday Americans can have more say in this country than the richest man in the world.
Others questioned whether it was a good thing to bid farewell to the promise of 25 to 40,000 new jobs and about $27 billion in new tax revenue to the city and state.
You know, she basically is taking the victory lap while thousands of people lost the American dream opportunity.
AOC, on the other hand, saw the pullout as a crucial step in securing a better economy for New Yorkers in the long run.
We say it's not just about any job. We need to create dignified jobs.
Working at Amazon in the warehouse for less than 15 an hour is the American dream.
Jacobin, for all we hate them, they had an issue, I think last year, it was just called The Working Class. And I think their first article was a narrative of an Amazon worker, of his everyday conditions going in and out of work. And it's like, it's dystopic as shit, you know. So I if that's the American dream, then, you know, I wonder.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, there are stories of people working there, but anecdotally too, I've had even like wrestlers who I know are hard workers tell me like, dude, it's insane. They don't let you take bathroom breaks, and there are people peeing in bottles. Like, so you got, you know, Amazon people sprinting from one end of the warehouse to another and like peeing in bottles. And this rich guy's like, you know, this is the American dream, yelling down from the Amazon loudspeaker, enjoy the American dream. Don't take bathroom breaks. Work, work, work.
Jobs that are part of a moral economy.
And it wasn't just the job quality that drove socialist opposition to Amazon's New York HQ too. Many socialists also argue that the fact that Amazon was set to take in billions in subsidies in the first place shows that in some ways we already live in a socialist economy, but a deeply flawed one, where it's the corporations that get the benefit, not the workers.
Stop saying oligarchy is reverse socialism. It's a stupid thing to say.
But even as the policy ideas of AOC and Sanders gain momentum, a lingering question remains. Will that popularity actually count for something when people go to vote? Or could the growing divide in the Democratic Party actually cost them the White House in 2020? President Trump has already begun to capitalize on this ideological rift by weaponizing the word socialism.
America will never be a socialist country.
Boo. Comrade Trump.
Socialists we spoke with think this kind of red scare language isn't driving away their voters. They feel their platform resonates not only with more progressive coastal cities, but also with the traditionally hard-to-crack Midwest.
I think that the Democratic Socialist candidate actually would have wider appeal
Midwestern marks, baby.
in cities on the East Coast. In fact, there's a segment of the Democratic base, real estate developers, trial lawyers, and Silicon Valley tech types who would absolutely abhor a Democratic Socialist candidate like Bernie Sanders.
Halsey Hazard is a recent NYU grad, a member of the DSA, and originally hails from Wisconsin.
Both of my parents are Republicans, and my dad's ex-military.
Do you think that New York's version of being a Democratic Socialist can thrive in the Midwest?
I mean, when you look at the fact that like Bernie won 71 out of 72 counties in Wisconsin in the 2016 primary, I think that shows that his sort of politics really resonate with a lot of people in the Midwest, for sure.
Part of what's driving socialism is...
Yeah, you just need actual socialist politics, not social democratic politics. People in the Midwest don't want to go halfway.
Yeah. But either way, there's at least in Dubuque, I haven't seen it much in Carbondale, but in Dubuque, there's fucking Bernie bumper stickers all over the place.
Absolutely. There's a ton in Iowa. A ton. I mean, and we saw it like going door to door. He was super popular, and there's a lot of union people who don't, who maybe even have more conservative or right wing like social views, but they vote Bernie because they're not stupid and they recognize that he's in, it's going to be in their interest.
They had that whole labor for Bernie thing.
That whole labor, yeah, right.
Labor for Bernie. I remember they had a meeting at the UAW Union Hall where the DSA meetings would take place. And one of the guys that was speaking was one of the national directors of the Labor for Bernie thing. And he was mentioning how in the place that he was from, I'm forgetting where it was, but Trump he had promised that he was going to bring back industry and bring back people's jobs. And he did it, right? And a lot of the people that were going for Bernie, that were in the working class there, ended up going for Trump after Bernie, had the election stolen because of Hillary. They ended up going for Trump afterwards. And now they're back to Bernie and participating in the Labor for Bernie thing. But yeah, he was super popular in the Midwest.
Fascinating. Yeah. And in the Midwest, I think we saw firsthand this idea that, everybody who was leaning Bernie, the idea that every Bernie voter went for Hillary rather than Trump is ridiculous. Like there are, like you said, there are a lot of union people who were like pro Bernie and then went for Trump in the general. But, like you said, Trump did promise to bring back a lot of jobs and industry, but have you seen what he's been promising recently?
Mm-mm.
He recently announced he would lead a proletarian revolution here.
Folks, the bourgeois, they know that more and more people are saying it. All these workers, we have the biggest workers, very handsome workers, come up to me and say, Comrade Trump, there is a spectrum on Europe, and you know what, they're right. These bourgeois are very nasty people, very, very rude and very unfair to the workers. They are stealing our surplus value, and no one is doing anything about it. The proletarian comes up to me every day and says, Comrade Trump, will you lead the revolution? And I got to turn to them and say, look, the instruments of capitalism, what we used to think about, it's destruction, believe me. Obama never wanted to seize them. Well, guess what? I'm seizing them. Landlord, we're done for, folks. Everyone told me, they said, Comrade Trump, you will be the vanguard of the revolution, and they would laugh. The media laughed, the Democrats laughed. Guess who's left?